Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. It's been a while since I've done a video, holidays, etc. So, this one's gonna either be a long video, or probably turn into a series of videos, and it might feel a little rambly for bits and pieces of it, because that's how I often do these things, but I think it'll come together. And as the title suggests, I really want to dive into what is it specifically that, I don't want to say makes a person a geek or a nerd, and we're not going to get into the diving into the differences between the two terms, because I'm going to use them more or less interchangeably, although I think they're not necessarily interchangeable. Because we have geek culture and nerd culture, but those are pretty broad umbrellas. But really, the question I'm asking is, what specifically is it about? What specific personality type or interests makes somebody fascinated with science fiction, fantasy, horror, technology, comic books, video games, all of these things? Because there's a lot of overlap. Action figure collectors tend to also be comic book fans, because some of the best action figures are based on comic books, right? Superheroes. Some of the best video games are based on comic books, and some of the best movies are based on comic books. But you have people that like myself, and I'm going to kind of use me as sort of a template, but also acknowledging that there are deviations. And not only that, there's subsets of these broader cultures. And so I'm going to kind of tackle some of that. Because within all of these, you have the broad mass pop culture, where, somebody might have a passing interest in some of this stuff. For example, general moviegoers might like something like Titanic and Independence Day, and The Ring, but then also really get into the Avengers and Spider-Man. And, but also not really have any interest in reading comic books or collecting comic books. Now, within all of these subsets of the broader umbrella of nerd culture, geek culture, and fandom culture, I guess you will, comic book, comic nerd, we'll say comic nerds, or comic geeks, toy geeks, etc., all these little subsets, there's a lot of overlap. Because a lot of times, backtracking, you have the broader appeal, right? Like the mass market, right? The mainstream stuff, like Star Wars and, the Avengers and the MCU and stuff like that. Jurassic Park is an example. There's a lot of these things that have mass appeal, because at their core, they're fun movies, and they challenge our imaginations. And the biggest, and I talked about this in my Blockbusters video as well, the thing is escapism, right? Escapism is a big part of, like, nerd culture. Getting out of your life and getting to live somebody else's life, right? Or see the world or experience the world through somebody else. This is one of the reasons why we tend to gravitate towards things like video games, because it allows us to interact with these experiences in a way that are more than just reading a book or watching a movie or reading a comic book or, whatever. And so, yeah, in the last, like, I would say 25 years, sci-fi culture has intersected with mainstream culture quite a bit. But nerd culture, geek culture, these things are sort of interconnected with sci-fi culture, because a lot of this stuff would very, very, very obviously be classified in some capacity or another as science fiction, especially comic books and most video games even. Well, not most, but a significant percentage of video games would either be classified as science fiction or fantasy. Now, I've done videos where I kind of try to untangle the difference between science fiction and fantasy, but I've tried to do it more from a within the geek culture perspective, not the broader, like, I'll use the term video store categories, because, like, Blockbuster would always have, like, the comedy section, the action adventure section, etc., etc. They would lump sci-fi and fantasy together. Netflix, Disney Plus, HBO Max, they all do this as well. Because to them, they're indistinguishable. And there's so many nuances in all these different things, which is why I said I'll break some of this stuff out, and sort of explore them on a more case-by-case basis. But I think the one unifying thing, and there's all these different subcultures within the geek culture, nerd culture, sci-fi fandom, and the one thing that unifies, I think, most of us is a fascination with good storytelling, right? It kind of goes back to escapism, and it kind of goes back to the aspirational stories, right? But we also really enjoy a lot of, like, dystopian sci-fi, Mad Max, The Running Man, The Hunger Games, just to name a few off the top of my head. There's countless others, I just can't think of them off the top of my head right now, but they're out there. And so you have, like, film fans, cinephiles, as they're sometimes called, that are a very specific type of nerd geek fan, right? They're obsessed with cinema. And cinephiles often seek out a broad range of movie experiences. They might enjoy a good rom-com, or a good action adventure flick, or a good sword and sorcery barbarian action adventure fantasy film, or they might like a good thriller, or a good horror movie, or a good slasher, or a good comic book space opera type thing, or they might just like a documentary type thing, or whatever. They might equally like Rambo, The Matrix, Citizen Kane, and Donnie Darko. I don't know. Cinephiles are a type of, and again, a subset of this fandom, right? This nerd culture. But they have, in some respects, a broader interest, because they like all types of movies, because they just are fascinated by cinema, the history, the technology, the geopolitics of it all, the art, the storytelling, the acting, the set dressing, etc. They're just fascinated by good movies, right? And so a lot of these people are the ones who have, like, massive, like, VHS, DVD, Laserdisc, Blu-ray collections, 4K collections, because they're the ones that just appreciate film as an art. Now, there are horror fans that are a type of cinephile, right? Like, they just love horror, and they collect because they want to get movies that are not easily accessible via, streaming services, or, digital rentals like, iTunes or Amazon or whatever. But the cinephile is also a more focused, more narrow, generally, type of fandom, if you will, than the broader nerd geek culture. But they're still within that. They're like one of the branches. And I say narrow because, generally speaking, those who classify themselves as cinephiles are just fascinated by movies, cinema, film, as an art form or a form of storytelling. They might enjoy a Superman or a Spider-Man or, Daredevil. Well, I don't know who enjoyed Daredevil, but whatever. Maybe they appreciate a bad movie sometimes too, or they see, they're like, this is fascinating for its historical context. But that's as far as they'll go. They're not really, generally, they might play video games like everybody does, it's just like everybody watches movies, but not everybody who watches movies is a cinephile. Not everybody who plays video games is a gamer. And when I say gamer, yes, I know the technical definition of gamer is people who play video games. But there is an identity. Those who consider gaming a part of their identity, where they don't just play video games, they live video games. They discuss them online. They read the news articles. They collect magazines and maybe ancillary products, like lunchboxes and breakfast cereals and McDonald's toys or whatever. Because they're like gamers. And a gamer, like a cinephile, is a type of nerd culture within the nerd geek culture. And I'm going to use nerd and geek interchangeably, even though I do think that there is a subtle distinction. But you can be a cinephile, or you can enjoy movies but not really classify yourself as a cinephile. Because that's the type of person who's like, no, I love movies, right? That's what the word cinephile means, film lover, cinema lover. And they appreciate the art, but these are also the people that want the best presentation. Like, these are the people that build home theater systems in their living rooms, or a special cave in their house. And these aren't, generally speaking, a lot of times these cinephiles, they're not buying a 60-inch OLED TV 4K display and then hooking it up to a sound bar. No. They've got a digital projector and a wall, that they've painted the right shade of white, and a full 7.1 DTS surround sound system, and like just, black blinds over the windows, so that like when they, turn the lights off to watch a movie, it's just like going to the movies. Those are like the most obsessive, but there's also like just people that love movies, that collect movies. They love to buy movies for various reasons. Horror fans, sci-fi fans tend to do this, and broader cinephiles, just because they just like movies. Now, yes, there's a lot of people that, are content with just like having Netflix and Disney Plus or whatever as sort of their cable service, but they'll still like buy their favorite movies on DVD or Blu-ray or whatever, so that they have at least access to it when they're in the mood, just in case their favorite streaming service is not showing their favorite movie at that time, and they're like, hey, you know what? I've got it. So yeah, you have that type of personality, right? You have like, everybody loves movies, but not everybody who loves movies is a cinephile. But not every cinephile is a collector, and not every movie collector is a cinephile. There's a lot of horror fans that collect movies because they love horror movies, and there's a lot of horror movies you just can't get on streaming services. And so they just buy them on VHS and Laserdisc because that's the only way to watch these movies. And so they appear to an onlooker outside looking in, oh yeah, that's just another type of cinephile. But horror fans, as a particular, also tend to like dark fantasy stuff, and sometimes there can be overlap with like comic books and stuff. But they're within movies, especially, you have another term that is often used to describe the geek culture within movie, broader movie culture, and that word is genre fans, right? Because another word that people use to describe these specific types of movies are genre films. Now, yes, every movie, just like music, can be classified into a type of genre. But when somebody says that they're a genre fan, they're specifically referring to these more fantastical things. Sci-fi, fantasy, maybe horror, things like that. These specific, easier to define genres, than like, a movie like IQ. That's not really a genre film. I mean, what's its genre? It's, if you went to Blockbuster, they used to have a section just called feature film, right? They had like westerns and musicals and sci-fi and comedy, and then they just had like feature film, because they're like, well, these are the movies we don't know how to classify. Hollywood Video did this. Hastings did this. Netflix and Amazon in particular, they try to get like real specific with their quote genres, and a lot of especially among nerd culture, people who argue on the internet or even have in-person discussions if they ever meet up at conventions and whatnot, there's a lot of disagreement over classifications of these different genres. The Terminator is a classic example. People will argue until they're blue in the face, is the Terminator a horror movie or not? Pro horror movie fans will say, yeah, it's a slasher. And other, people will say, no, it's a tech thriller. Get over yourselves. And then people argue over this. And so, like Hollywood, air quotes, the industry people, right? Media journalists, these streaming services, the old video rental stores, movie theaters, things like that. They would say, well, you have like film, movies, cinema, etc., and then you have genre films. And those are born out of, the old Western, which eventually, bled into the sci-fi, fantasy, horror umbrella, and then morphed into things like Star Wars, and then we got into the, where we are today. But a lot of those genre films were based on these, like, fantastical stories, right? The hero's journey, things like that. A lot of them came from comic books, right? These were like, older one, like Tarzan or pulp books, not just comic books, but pulp magazines, etc. Things like Tarzan and Zorro and the Musketeers, and then, Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, stuff like that. And those things eventually, and then you had the Universal monster movies, right? Dracula and Frankenstein and all of those, which were based on books. Just at the time, we wouldn't have had a word for, we wouldn't, they wouldn't, when Dracula was published, at the time it was published, bookstores or libraries wouldn't have had a horror section. They wouldn't have classified it as a horror book. maybe Thriller, or maybe even Thriller didn't exist. Those words have been retroactively applied to these things by us. I've talked about that in a previous video as well. Couldn't tell you which one because I'm all over the place. But then you have gamers, right? Again, thanks to the DS, the Wii, and Tetris on the Game Boy, you've got a lot of, like, your aunt, your grandma, your Uncle Bob, etc. that play, like, Nintendogs or Wii Sports or Pac-Man or whatever. Well, just because you play a video game doesn't really make you a gamer. And I'm saying, okay, yes, if you want to call yourself a gamer, and if the only thing you play is Pac-Man, then great. But, like, within the culture, there's this self-identity, right? Especially people within, like, the LGBT community, we're all about self-identity. Like, how you identify needs to be respected. Because that's just, what we're all about. But, like, you have people, like, just casual people, right? Just regular people that like movies, they like to listen to music, they like to read a book, they watch, television, and they'll pick up a controller and play a Madden or a Call of Duty or, a Mario or Animal Crossing or whatever. But they don't really, if you ask them, are you a gamer? They're like, well, no, I mean, I'm play video games, but I don't make that my identity, right? There's people that just, for example, there's like, there are people that eat food, right? Everybody eats. But then there are, like, food aficionados, right? Food critics. I don't know all of the terminologies, but there are, like, people that are just, like, obsessed with food and eating, and they make that their whole identity. So, yeah, that's a type of personality, and there's, quote, fandoms and things like that. But I want to pluck that out, because I know a lot of people, especially those that aren't really within these subcultures, think that, if you like a comic book movie, then you must be a nerd. If you play video games or use a computer, you must be a geek. Or because geek culture is popular, so they're like, oh yeah, well, everybody's a geek. Or they think they take the word geek or nerd and they twist it and use it as a synonym for fan or fanatic. So, like, sports fans will say, oh, I'm a sports nerd. No, you're a sports fan. You're not a fucking nerd. Nerds and sports fans are incompatible. A lot of times because the sports fans, especially football jocks, were the cockroaches that were bullying us when we were kids for being nerds and geeks. So no, you don't get to call yourself a nerd if you're a sports fan. Now, there are nerds, geeks, outcasts, if you will, whatever, that enjoy sports, right? But there's also, like, geeks that, like, eat at McDonald's, but they don't consider themselves fanatics of McDonald's. They're just like, yeah, it's good food. I eat there when I feel like it. It's fucking food. So just because you have a strong interest in something does not make you a member of this geek culture. And one of the ways you can tell the difference between someone that is a geek or a nerd and someone that just has an interest in some of these things is we will seek out others like us, our own community, right? Now, yes, you have like social media, YouTube and Twitter and Instagram and Blue Sky and Threads and everything else, where people will express their opinions and things, because yeah, that's human nature, and the internet has made it more accessible for people to express opinions. But you have people that'll go on Twitter and they're like, oh, they'll tweet about football, or they'll tweet about politics, or they'll tweet about, like, McDonald's is doing this thing or whatever. And then, like, oh, I just saw the new Superman and I loved it, blah, blah, blah. Those aren't really geeks. Those are just people that just, like, they're just regular people that happen to like a thing that geeks like. For example, everybody listens to music, right? But there are people that are classical music aficionados, right? They're just like classic music nerds, right? They only like, Mozart and Bach and Beethoven and blah, blah, blah. And then you have like metalheads, right? These are people that make metal their whole fucking identity, right? Anything that they can classify as metal, right? Music, video games, movies, comic books, whatever. So I would say like a metalhead is definitely within the subset of what we call a geek or a nerd, right? This geek culture. Because that's their whole fucking identity. And that, I think, is the key sticking point that a lot of people within these communities get frustrated by the people who are technically outside the community that try to pin these labels on themselves when it's like, that doesn't really apply. You're using the word wrong. And I think the reason for that is because geek culture became mainstream, a lot of people mistake or confuse pop culture with geek culture because geek culture is popular, and so they're like the same thing, but they're not the same thing. But let me get back to what I was saying a minute ago, right? You have music, right? You have the metalheads, and like I said, it's all about identity. So a metalhead is someone who will tell you they're a metalhead. Now, there are people that are, just casual fans of music that might be like, oh, well, I like Metallica or Motorhead or some, I don't know, 9 Inch. I don't know metal music, so I'm just naming bands that I've been told are metal. I don't know. And they'll just... Metal Jesus Rocks is a prime example. He will tell you he's a fucking metalhead. And he will also tell you he's a gamer. Because that's how he identifies. He's not going to be like, oh, I'm also a McDonald'site. Well, no, he probably eats at McDonald's, but he doesn't make eating at McDonald's his identity. There are people that do. You also have Disney adults, right? We hear about that. People, so that's what the real crux of it is. How do you identify, right? Because you have people that are like, oh, well, they like eating McDonald's, but they don't consider themselves, quote, fans of fast food. They're just like, hey, I'm broke, I'm hungry, I'm in a hurry, I can swing by McDonald's and for like $7 get a bunch of food. Real quick. But then you have people that are actual McDonald's nuts, right? They want all of the toys, the Happy Meals, the memorabilia, the commemorative cups and whatnots. So again, a lot of times we'll say if somebody's obsessive about something, or they make that whatever their obsession is a part of their identity, whether their whole identity or the focal point or whatever, they'll say, oh, I'm a McDonald's geek or a sports geek or a car geek or a car nerd or whatever. No, don't take the word nerd and use it as a synonym for fanatic, right? And the reason why I say that is because there's a deeper culture. There's a deeper connectedness, not just within the community of nerds and geeks, but there's also like the core, what makes you a geek in the first place, right? Geek culture, nerd culture, these things that we like being popular, doesn't make the person that isn't one of us that likes it one of us. For example, okay, no more examples. Let me get into the why. Here's why, okay? When you go to school, okay, you're in middle school, and you're wearing a Pac-Man t-shirt, and you've got the Super Mario lunchbox, and you're sitting with at the geek table with your fellow nerds, and you're discussing Dungeons and Dragons and Power Rangers and Mortal Kombat and whatever else. These other people, right, that aren't sitting at your table are the ones that are making fun of you, bullying you, pushing you around, tripping you. Yeah, even back, like I'll say, going back to the 80s and 90s, before geek culture, pop culture, genre culture, whatever you want to call it, became like this interchangeable glob of bullshit. Yeah, you would have the jocks, the assholes, the nerd, or not nerds, but like the motorheads is what they used to call them, the car aficionados. Today we would say dude bros, right? In the Hollywood context of teen movies like Pretty in Pink or She's All That, etc., they would be like, these are the popular kids. Obviously they're going to make fun of the various cliques, right? Well, that's the thing. You have all these little cliques, right? Well, being in a clique doesn't make you a nerd or a geek. A geek is a type of clique. Just like the jocks are a type of clique. Now, you can be a jock and also like metal music and also like horror movies and also play video games, but not really identify yourself as a nerd or a geek. Because either one, you don't want to be because you're afraid, you'll get bullied. But also because, you like those things, but you also like McDonald's and you also like, Adam Sandler and all this other shit that has nothing to do with geek culture. And you're like, okay, sure. But maybe you also happen to like The Matrix because you thought it was a cool movie, right? But then, what the fuck is a geek, right? That's what I'm asking. Or that's what you're asking if you clicked on this video. And I liked to use the Hollywood teen comedy trope of cliques because I think that helps illustrate what it really means to be a geek, right? Some people will say outcast. Well, no, that's a different thing, because you can have no interest in any of this shit. You can be an art nerd or the band geek and be an outcast. But I think what a lot of these people within these communities, especially if you go outside of social media and you go into Discord servers and very specific fan forums like Blu-ray.com forum or DVD forum or Game FAQs forum, the discussion boards, Go Nintendo, etc. And you try to have conversations with people in these communities, right, that have a passion for these different things. You're going to find out that you probably don't share, one, their personality, two, their passion, and three, their interests. You might be like, oh, I really liked the the Marvel movies, right? The MCU. Maybe I'm a comic book geek, so you go to comicbookresources.com or whatever, or you find a Discord server where people are discussing comic books, and you realize, oh wait, what the fuck is a Jim Lee? Who the hell is a Spawn? Ultraverse? What? And then people start throwing around all these things like, a McFarlane run or, so-and-so art or whatever. And you're just like, nah, I just like fucking Iron Man. Like Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr. It was a good movie. And yeah, I loved all the movies, so I thought maybe I was into these things, but then you realize you're not. And it isn't like you won't be welcome in these communities, because a lot of these communities will welcome anybody in with open arms, because a lot of us are, not the true geeks, I will say, are not mainstream and not popular like people think. Because there's a lot of people that think, well, nerd culture is popular. Yes, culture, yes. the sci-fi, comic books, fantasy, horror, those things are popular. But that's just popular with like the broader masses. The people who live for these things, who obsess about them on the internet, who write on their blogs or keep notebooks with lists of all their favorite, action stars, and categorize things into like different types of martial arts and different types of sci-fi, dystopian futures and time travel with robotics or space opera, etc. If those words mean nothing to you, then you're not a fucking geek. Period. Because you would know what they mean, because you sought them out, because you cared. You're passionate. And that is the next piece of the puzzle that a lot of people forget about. Just liking Superman doesn't make you a comic book nerd. But being so passionate and obsessive about Superman that you collect the comics and you discuss it online and you buy the toys and then you have the lunchbox and you go to the movies and you care and you watch the shows and the cartoons and you care enough that you're like, yeah, I really want to know who's writing Superman and what else is out there. You're a geek. You're a nerd. But if you're just like, oh, yeah, I thought Superman, I don't know, fucking Man of Steel or whatever was a good movie, but I also thought, The Green Mile was a good movie, and so was Forrest Gump. Okay, are you going to go out and read a comic book adaptation of Forrest Gump, or the continuing adventures of Forrest Gump in comic book form? No. You just thought it was a good movie. And so that doesn't make you a geek because you like something that geeks like. But I wanted to lay out the what is a geek, right? Before I got into the why, right? Because that's what I'm really getting at. You have these people, right? Geeks, nerds, whatever. That are, one, the social outcasts. Often have social anxiety or neurodivergent disorders, or not really disorders, but they're neurodivergent, or they have mental health issues, or things like that. Bipolar, ADHD, autism spectrum, etc. You don't have to be neurodivergent to be a geek, but a lot of geeks are neurodivergent, and a lot of neurodivergent people are geeks because neurodivergent people obsess over things, and that's what the word that's the right. It's the one aspect of geek culture we all kind of agree on is if you obsess over it so much that you make it your identity, yeah, that makes you a X type of geek, right? And sometimes you replace the word geek with like gamer, or comic nerd or whatever, horror fanatic, or horror nut, or whatever word people apply, right? But you have this underlying like interconnected things that are all like very similar, right? Dungeons and Dragons, video games, comic books, science fiction, fantasy, horror, computers, robotics, technology, science, space travel, so they're all kind of interconnected, right? And each person with this personality type, within this subculture, has different interests, right? Some people will, bring anime into this, or types of music into this, because they're like, well, they're obsessive over music or whatever, or they discover that, hey, I like a lot of sci-fi and horror movies, and they all tend to have this type of soundtrack. I like this music because it makes me feel whatever I feel when I'm watching those movies, I feel the same thing when I listen to this music. So then they go seek out that type of music, and then they discover they're a fan of that type of music, whether it's hair metal or techno or whatever, music genre your favorite, movie uses. Same with video games and things like that. And so, gaming, video games as a whole, are just like movies. They're so popular that, like, everybody plays video games. But not everybody that plays video games is a gamer. Now, you don't have to have, like, there's not like a checklist, like, where it's like, well, you have to collect action figures, and you have to like comic books, and you have to like sci-fi and horror and computers, and you have to know how to program a Linux, and you have to know the difference between a kernel and an operating system and a DOS or a BIOS. If you don't have, there's and this is where a lot of it comes into the nuance, right? Because, like, there's a lot of people that are like, well, yeah, we're all generally fascinated by the same things, science, technology, and the possibilities of these things. So when you have a fascination with science and technology, right? You love computers, but not. Yeah, everybody has a phone. Everybody uses a computer, but then there's people that, like, love computers, right? The geeks like gadgets, right? Fascination with technology. These people know the difference, not just like the Wikipedia overview, but like the intricacies, the histories, and all the different technical bits and bobs and why they are of, like, VHS versus Betamax, or Laserdisc versus CED, or how lasers, the different wavelengths of a laser, like the red laser on a like the red book laser versus a blue violet laser, etc. The people that also know the difference between, like I said, a BIOS, an OS, a DOS, and a kernel. I'm not going to try to explain those words. If you're a geek or a nerd, or you know how to find out that information. If you don't know, if you don't care, because you're just like, I don't fucking care, you're not a geek, you're not a nerd, because you just don't fucking care. And that's the thing, you have no passion. But the thing that unifies all of us, geeks, nerds, gamers, etc., all of this geek culture, is a fascination with science and technology. Whether it's analog or digital technology, whether it's like astronomy or paleontology, it's this belief that humans can do so much more with our environment than just, stapled together wood houses and put fire in brick ovens. It's like a fascination with technology. And that is what leads somebody that has, if you have a fascination with technology, you're going to become obsessive about comic books because you're into science and technology. Then you're not just satisfied with a good story. It has to make sense. It has to make logical, scientific sense. Or you can suspend disbelief, if you will, or you can be like, you know what? Hey, I'll accept that Earth's yellow sun does some kind of science that we don't understand to Superman or any Kryptonian's DNA on a cellular level that makes them superheroes when they're near a yellow sun. We just don't have in our current IRL scientific understanding of what that would be. Well, that's because in real life, Krypton doesn't exist, and there probably isn't a race of humanoids that if they came in contact with the yellow sun would become superhuman. But we have no way of knowing because anyone that would be is so astronomically far away from us in terms of light years that we'll all be dead for millions of years before any information regarding their civilizations ever made it within our galaxy. And so, this is the reason why geeks argue over the things that do and don't make sense in a Star Wars or a Star Trek or an Iron Man or whatever. Because, by and large, at our core, and I have been in this geek fandom since I was a kid, and I have had these conversations on discussion forums and Discord groups and Yahoo chat rooms and IRQs and everything else. Okay? Usenet groups. I'm old enough to know what the fuck Usenet is. You can Google it if you want. If you're a geek, you probably already know, or as soon as I said the word Usenet, your ears perked up and now you're typing up what it is because now you're fascinated. Because it's this fascination with science and technology and human ingenuity, which does include science fiction, but also imagination. And it also carries over into things like art and music and appreciation of all these things that humans are capable of doing. Right? Yes, there is a component of escapism. I brought that up at the start of the video. And there is a component of aspirational, I can't be Batman, obviously, but I can watch a Batman movie or play a Batman video game or read a Batman comic book and feel what Batman feels through his eyes via this, whatever it is. Or I can collect Batman action figures and have a tangible representation of Batman in my world that I can recreate my interpretation of what I think Batman is in my living room or bedroom or toy room or whatever. So that is why I say it's more than just an identity, and it's more than just being obsessive about something. Yes, sports jocks that are also into sports betting and that are also into like stats and fantasy football or whatever are very much obsessive personality traits. But they're not geeks. Because their interest in sports is so divorced from our interest in Spider-Man. Yeah, they might also like Spider-Man, but they like it for a different reason. We're coming at it from the potential, the human potential of mixing radiation and DNA, human DNA, to modify a human's physical attributes at the genetic cellular level in a fantastical story. The football jock just thinks it's cool. Spider-Man looks cool, and he can throw cars, and he's a buff dude, and he can beat up the bad guys. He probably doesn't care about, the difference between the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man having naturally occurring webbing in his wrists versus the every other version of Spider-Man where he is a genius and invents his own chemical webbing compound that has the tensile strength comparable, adjusted for inflation, but more accurately, that's a term people are familiar with, but adjusted for his size versus the scale of a spider web, right? He can pick up a car with his webbing, because if a spider this big was Tobey Maguire's size, his web would be strong enough to hold a car, because that's how just like proportional it would scale. But the football jock is just like, oh, he looks cool in the suit and he punches bad guys. Okay, but that doesn't make you yeah, you can be a Spider-Man fan. You love the movies. Maybe you pick up a comic book. You watch the cartoon. You're like, oh, okay, fuck it. I'll buy a toy or two. Just put it on my bookshelf or on top of my TV or whatever. But that in and of itself, just liking something geeks like, doesn't make you a geek. Obsessing over something in a comparable manner to what geeks obsess over doesn't make you a geek, because that's being obsessive isn't what makes you a geek or a nerd. And again, I'm using the two terms interchangeably here. Within the nerd and geek culture, the dynamic is basically nerds are fascinated with science and technology, and geeks are just like the posers that are into that like the things nerds like. Well, I'm not necessarily a fan of that descriptor, but there are people online, especially within these communities, that will tell you that, you're a geek, not a nerd. Do not call me a nerd, I'm a geek, blah, blah, blah. They'll get offended if you use the wrong term, right? And like I said, I am specifically using them interchangeably, not necessarily to make this video accessible, but also because I am a believer that the nuance between a nerd and a geek is so minuscule that they're essentially the same thing. Okay? But an obsessive sports fan who literally is like, sports is their thing, but yeah, they also like the movie Titanic, or they like Rocky, and yeah, okay, they like Iron Man because it's popular. Okay, well, that's not the same thing as a geek, And you know how you can tell is because when you start talking about horror movies, science fiction, comic books, and you bring up, these scientific principles that don't make sense, or the logical inconsistencies that don't make sense, they're the first ones that will tell you it's just a fucking movie, get over it. And that's how you know the difference. Because they don't care. To them, it is just a movie. But to a geek, a nerd, it's more than just a movie. It's more than just a video game. It's more than just a comic book. It's more than just a D&D campaign session. Or it's more than just an action figure or a Transformer toy or a fucking computer program. It's our whole fucking, reason for existence. You don't have to check all the boxes. There's no criteria. How you know if you're a geek or a nerd is like, well, am I obsessive about all these things, or am I fascinated by these particular things? Obsession and fascination are the two things that tell you. Now, within those two things, right, you can manifest your obsession into your fascination in different interests, right? You might be passionate and fascinated and obsessed with anime, but you like a type of anime, or you're just obsessive with anime in general. And that might lead you to like kaiju. That might lead you to, tokusatsu. That might lead you to Power Rangers and Godzilla, etc., etc. I apologize if I mispronounced any of those words. I'm, in that regard, an outsider looking in. Yes, I like Power Rangers, but I don't know shit about the Super Sentai that it's based on. Outside of, how it became Power Rangers. Because I'm not I tried to watch Super Sentai. I'm not interested. I don't care about Godzilla. That's just, not my thing. But I do know that even anime fans will tell you that one of the, one of the things that we're fascinated with, that they're fascinated with, is this idea of the impossible being made possible via either magic or technology, right? Which is why fantasy and horror overlap with sci-fi so much. These Arthurian legends and medieval, D&D based stories, and Middle Earth, Lord of the Rings stuff, kind of carries over into things like, Game of Thrones and, Final Fantasy and Diablo, etc. Because the fascination is with the impossible. Using whatever resources available, science, magic, alchemy, whatever, to make the impossible possible. It's stretching the imagination. And so, if any of that tickled your brain cells, right, and lit up your electrons and made you like, ooh, tingly, I need to know more about X, Y, Z, then you're probably a geek, and that's just your manifestation of it. Those are the things you're interested in. And a lot of times, you'll start out interested in one, and that will lead to another, will lead to another. For example, I started out, my earliest interest was in computers because of Transformers. I had GoBots and Transformers toys and action figures, and I watched the cartoon and read a couple of the comic books. I was fascinated with these alien robots that turned into like guns and tanks and trucks and cars and planes and everything else. And so that led me into eventually a fascination with Star Wars because, science and robots and technology is all intertwined with Star Wars. And that led me to, Batman, and that led me to Mario and the Ninja Turtles and blah, 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 blah. And I think one of the reasons why so many of these things overlap is because they at their core, they do all have a basis in science and science fiction, right? Science, technology, discovery, which is why a lot of times nerds, geeks that have a fascination with comics or horror or movies or video games or whatever will seek out an education, whether it's formal or informal, just reading Wikipedia articles or buying books or whatever, or actually going to college. Whatever piques their interest, but that will lead them into a career path that will, allow them to utilize their skills, but also, further their own quest for knowledge, right? And so, in the classical sense, in the old, like, Revenge of the Nerds, a nerd was somebody that had more or less a preferential fascination and lifestyle bent towards academia. If you were more interested in education and learning and science and history and all that other stuff, you were called a nerd. Geeks were those that had probably no interest in going to college or whatever. They just were fascinated with, like, heavy metal music and Dungeons and Dragons and superhero comics and, video games, and then maybe they use their computer as a tool. And so they interconnected geeks. So I liken it like this. Nerds and geeks used to be separate, right? But then they got married. The two communities sort of came together and formed a new union that has branched out into the broader pop culture and trickled into other things. So it's gotten bigger. But there's still smaller communities within these communities and a lot of times you'll hear people that are that have a fascination with multiple things interact with these diehard fandoms, will tell you, like, oh, X fans are blah blah blah, and they'll be like, well, I like X, but I'm not as into it as they are. But your fandom might be L. You're like, well, I love L. I'm obsessed over L. You can have X. I want L. X is cool, but I'm over here. This is why things like Star Wars, the Terminator, Star Trek, the Matrix, the Iron Man, the MCU, these things have sort of broad universal appeal within the geek and nerd culture, because they're all based on the same idea. The idea of humans stretching our own intellect and our own understanding of the universe to bend the forces of nature to our will. That's literally what computer science is all about, is using electricity and funneling it into these pieces of silicone that are crunching numbers so astronomically fast that you cannot comprehend, that allow us to do these things, realize these things that we have a fascination with. Things like, oh, now we can use computers to, use CGI to enhance our filmmaking techniques so that we can actually have a compelling Avengers movie. So it's not just a bunch of people in rubber suits. Well, because, that don't look good. Yeah, practical effects are good, and better when augmented with CGI. So if you can do practical, models, etc., yes, go for it. But sometimes you have to use CGI to realize things that you just can't do otherwise. Just because it wouldn't look right. It wouldn't look believable. And you can only do that because we have computers. You can get onto your Nintendo console and go to Hyrule and adventure and go fight, the Moblins and Ganon and blah 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 through the lens of Link on your Nintendo system, your computer box, your specialized computer that runs specialized Nintendo computer software to play a video game. We call it a video game, but it is still computer software is what it is. What is a computer software? It's just a bunch of zeros and ones passing through the piece of silicone inside of your little device. Well, if you don't know not just what the word CPU means and the difference between a CPU and a GPU, but fundamentally how it works and why it works, then you're probably not a geek, because you don't give a fuck. You turn your computer on, you use your phone, you use it as a tool. There's like people that drive cars, right? And then there are car aficionados that obsess. They know every little detail about torque and horsepower and, all those other terms that I don't fucking know. I used to work at an Advanced Auto Parts, so I know some of them casually, but I don't fucking care. And yeah, that's the thing. There are people that use a car as a tool. They just drive it to get to work or to get to the grocery store or to go to church or whatever. And then there are people that just live for cars. They know every detail about cars. They'll take them apart, put them back together. They'll tell you all the little things, little mechanical bits and bobs that make this specific car fascinating to them for whatever reason. That is a type of technology. And yes, I would say motorheads are more and probably have more in common with nerds and geeks than your typical jocks do. And I say typical, again, meaning that the stereotypical. Yes, I know I have friends who are geeks, who are nerds, who could build a computer from scratch, who can program Nintendo eShop titles if they wanted to, or Roblox software, who read comic books, who watch horror movies, etc., that also like football, or also like soccer or whatever. And that's the thing. Just liking something doesn't make you a fanatic or obsessive of that thing. And obsessing over one thing doesn't mean you only have to like that one thing. You can like other things. And then, depending on how passionate you are, you can have multiple obsessions. You can be a gamer and be like, yes, I'm a gamer. I'm obsessed with games. I own multiple Sega, Atari, PlayStation, Nintendo, Xbox consoles and computers and blah, blah, blah. But also be a horror fan and also be an action figure collector and also be fascinated by model trains and still like to watch NBA basketball. And know enough about your car to, get it to the shop when it's time for maintenance. So you can have multiple interests. And I think what it really comes down to, again, going back to LGBT community member here, trans woman, a lot of it's just going to be self-identification. If you identify as a gamer or an anime, whatever anime fans call themselves, or, whatever word you use it, wear it. That's your badge. It's your right. And then make people stick to it. And then if somebody else that wears that badge says, you're not a true XYZ, whatever, flip them a middle finger and tell them to eat shit. Because at the end of the day, none of this bullshit that I just said for the last hour means anything to anybody unless it does. If it doesn't mean anything to you, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean you're not a nerd or a geek. It doesn't mean that you're not a fanatic or obsessive or neurodivergent or whatever. It just means that you might not be specifically obsessive or fascinated by or interested in or have a desire to know more about a specific thing. I see within all these different communities, because I have multiple fascinations, Dungeons and Dragons, comic books, video games, action figures, horror, etc. I have a broad fascination because I do see the through line that connects all these things together. And liking video games doesn't mean you like every video game. You can get 35 gamers together in a room and none of them will tell you that their favorite game is the same as anybody else. They're all going to have a different favorite game. And I just pulled the number 35 out of thin air because, everybody uses arbitrary numbers, and I just wanted to make one up that you haven't heard before. I don't know. I could have said 3,700. Any number of gamers you get together. But that doesn't mean that they're not gamers, and they'll be like, oh, I like Final Fantasy VII, but someone else will be like, well, Final Fantasy VII was okay, but I actually prefer Chrono Trigger. And someone else is going to come along and be like, well, I like this other game that me personally, have never heard of, but that's their favorite game. That's okay. That's, because there's subgenres within video games as well. And gamers will obsessively argue over what makes a game X, Y, or Z. I see it all the time. People will bitch and moan if somebody calls something a Metroidvania and it doesn't check all the boxes that they think it needs to. And they'll be like, actually, and then they'll tell you why that's not a Metroidvania. Yeah, I know, I've done this stuff too, because yes, I'm a geek, I'm a nerd, I'm obsessive. And I am neurodivergent, so that's why I obsess about this stuff. And yes, I have a fascination with science and technology and astronomy, and robotics and computers and programming. And yes, I know basic programming, and I know a little bit of C++, programming, and I little teeny tiny bit of Java and HTML because I studied this stuff. Some of it in college, some of it before college, some of it in high school, because I'm just obsessive about this stuff. I'm not like college professor level of knowledgeable about any of this shit to be able to teach a class or to really get into the nitty-gritty of all of this stuff. The stuff that I am fairly knowledgeable about, yeah, I'm going to talk about it. But just like geeks have a broad, fascination with narrow things, right? Within the science and technology, we have a broad fascination of, comic books, right? Well, some people prefer DC, some people like Marvel, some people want Image, some people like Dark Horse, some people like IDW. Some people don't give a fuck, they like it all. Okay. So, what it really comes down to is this. If you think you're a geek and you're not sure, ask yourself how passionate do you want to be about it? a thing? How obsessive are you willing to become? And then, you know, ask yourself, what are other things you're interested in and what's your interest level? You know, you can like video games, but you don't have to like Halo. You don't have to like Mario. You don't have to fucking like Pokemon. You can hate Pokemon and still be a gamer. Don't let anybody tell you any otherwise. There's no such thing as a true gamer or a true Star Wars fan or a true horror nerd or whatever. I know fans. I have friends, acquaintances, etc., people that I've interacted with that love horror movies, that hate Friday the 13th. I have friends that are Nintendo gamers that can't stand The Legend of Zelda. Like, just fucking hate it. It just bores them to tears. They would rather play Smash Brothers or Chibi Robo or something else. And that's okay. So I think at the end of the day, what really makes somebody seek out nerd culture, geek culture, seek out other nerds, other geeks, is this fascination with science, technology, and the human spirit, ingenuity, right? What are we able to do to make the impossible possible, right? That's the definition I gave. And then you want to seek out other people that have similar manifestations of that, and similar interests, right? You might not be aware of that's why you like, you know, horror or Spider-Man or, you know, Halo. But then when you actually sit down and intellectually piece it together and analyze it and, you know, break it down on a psychological and intellectual level, you realize that, oh yeah, that's the common thread. Now, you're not going to do that if you're not a geek, because you don't give a fuck, you don't care enough, because you're not obsessive. Now, not doing that doesn't mean you're not a geek. It just means that that wasn't something that crossed your mind at that particular point in your life. And you can be totally fascinated with NASA and space travel and space opera and Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica and blah, 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 and have zero interest in Jurassic World and paleontology and dinosaurs. You don't have to like all of science and technology to be fascinated with science and technology. You can be fascinated with, like, you know, a type of technology, be it computers or VCRs or Blu-rays or electronic keyboards or synthesizers or turntables or whatever. Doesn't mean you have to have an interest or any other of it. You like what you like. And again, I'm going to reiterate what I said at the beginning of the video and throughout the video. How you identify is up to you. If you want to say you're a geek, you're a fucking geek. Now, there are people within the geekdom, these subcultures, these sub-communities, that will argue with you. And you know what? If you're a true geek, you'll argue back. You'll defend yourself. Stay cool.